friends. We want to welcome you to the second in our series of Navigating the Wilderness, our program that we are experimenting with offering webinars, and we are delighted to have you back again. We're happy to have you, whether you were here with us for part one or whether you are new to this session. And we hope that we will have this series up also on the Connecticut Conference website in the next month or so as an ongoing resource to you. In the short run, you may request the slides and the Zoom links from me. Do know that I will be sending you some links and some resources in the next couple of days. On our agenda tonight is resourcing you in your thinking and your doing about ways to increase the vitality, the creativity, and the impact of your ministry. So I'm going to begin by talking about why attractional approaches don't quite cut it for us anymore. Though they may have some important things to teach us, and Charlie will help us to shift our thinking about the work of our churches from maintenance to mission. And then he'll toss the ball back to me and I'll talk about creating the leadership needed for change. And then we'll have some summary remarks and some opportunities for you to do some questions and answers towards the end. Now, there are two ways for you to get remarks to us. One is to use the raise your hand feature, and the other is to simply use a chat to chat us your questions. And I'd actually love it if somebody would test a chat so we can see if that's working. In the meanwhile, I'll just go ahead. Excellent, I'm seeing some chatting. Perfect, that looks like it's working. Great. This Zoom technology gives you two ways. Oh, I just covered that about getting the questions to us. So what are attractional approaches to church vitality? They are those adjustments, enhancements, and programs which are geared to make your church more attractive to the community members and newcomers. They address things such as advertising, signage, programs to get people in the church door, and to make them feel more welcome once they're there. There are many really excellent resources out there on increasing church vitality by getting people through the door. And to be sure, many churches would benefit from improving their ability to attract and maintain and retain members. But still, those approaches work only when what people get once they come through the door is actually what they deeply want and truly need. If you get people through the door, but the worship doesn't recognize the current culture and the community lacks a particular kind of warmth and authenticity, then newcomers don't stick. Or people might not even show up in the first place because you're still asking people to do something they might have no interest in, no knowledge of, or have tried before and decided is not for them. So there is really no way forward without getting very real about how much our world has changed regarding what people deeply want and truly need. So for the sake of a little playful reflection, I thought I'd do a little comparison between the 1980s and now. And I picked the 1980s because I heard my call to ministry somewhere around 1980. But before I went to divinity school, I worked for 2 years at Geico Insurance Company, way before those Gecko ads came out. We actually used to call it Geek-O. And yes, I worked on one of these very early IBM machines with a 5-inch floppy disk and a flashing carrot. The other picture on the now side is actually a picture of my computer as I was preparing these slides. In the early 1980s, I had friends who lived in New York City, and without cell phones, we used to use the analog way of meeting up in New York City, which is basically to pick a time to meet by the clock in Grand Central Terminal. And if your friend ran late, well, you just paced around for a while wondering where your friend was, and sometimes your friend just didn't show up. A smartphone replaced so many things we used to cart around with us. Our tastes have changed. In the 1980s, grocery stores had an aisle with both sides, nothing but cereals. Things like granola bars were few and far between. Forget muesli. Now cereal is about a quarter of your average grocery aisle. And I just paid attention to my own local grocery store and discovered it was, in fact, just a quarter, one half of one side, and the other side was all snacks and candy. Remember the TV guide? We used to plan our week around the TV schedule. I actually once made a boyfriend change a whole trip he had planned for us because there was a 6-part TV series and I wanted to get the end of it. I don't even remember what the series was. I can't imagine it was that important or that good. The changed world has also impacted learning and working. In the classroom, we have moved from isolated desks and the assumption that the teacher is the purveyor of the lesson to group and engaged learning methods. And this is reflected in office spaces as well. My husband, who has worked for large companies such as GE, has always been in buildings with separate offices and cubicles. Both of my kids, who are young adults in their 20s, work in companies with open rooms and shared tables. Now, I'll reserve judgment about whether that's all for the good. It doesn't really matter whether we like it or not, or judge it good or not. What matters is that we at least need to recognize that things have changed. Now, the 1980s may seem like the halcyon days for the church, but even by then, some of the trends in the main line were very evident, and church mergers and closings were already starting to happen. Over the course of my life in ministry, there has been one book after another that has been about church renewal or growth or market share or addressing our anxieties or the changing landscape. And I just picked a few off my shelf behind me to highlight here. Hey, Charlie, do you remember reading Good to Great together on the conference staff?
Absolutely.
Another indicator of the changed environment is the emergence of a whole new vocabulary about church people, the SB&Rs, the nuns, and the duns. For these folk, by and large, attractional models of church vitality are not that effective. Church has real competition. In the surveys done by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, churchgoing shows up under other leisure activities. So that's that little light blue wedge up top. Notice how much time TV, which includes live streaming, takes of our leisure time. And I just want us to be honest about this here. This statistic is not about what they do, it's about what we do too. Now, these numbers were really surprising to me, but they shouldn't be. It used to be our faithful members were in church about 3 out of every 4 Sundays. Our clergy are increasingly reporting that people who consider themselves faithful members are showing up maybe 6 to 10 times a year. And here's another picture. This, by the way, is statistics for people who are religious activity participants. So these are churchgoers who are answering these questions, not the general population. And what this implies is what we know already, churchgoing is happening a little less and less. Statistically not super significant, but worth noting here is a slight uptick in religious practice, just not the type that involves traditional worship service. This may be an opportunity for us. In other words, we are moving out of the kind of movie theater, let's all gather at one time at a certain place type of church, and into perhaps something that's more like the Netflix home-delivered, customized religious practice. Now, there's a lot of wonderment about why it is that organized religious activity has been on a long, slow decline. Robert Putnam did some excellent thinking about this and engagement in civic organizations in general. So I'll pause for just a second here to give you a chance to read this. In general, Putnam found that an increase in television watching was most correlated with the decrease of civic engagement. And that was some work he did in the mid-1990s. So these trends are just increasing. And things have certainly gotten more complicated now with the number of screens and varieties of ways that we can self-entertain or entertain with those who are most closely domiciled with us. By the way, I just discovered a great series called Loch Ness, if you like the British police procedural. See, I'm going to admit I'm completely complicit in these statistics, aren't we all? So back to these books. They're all good. They're all still good. And again, we know kind of what to do. It's all about getting back to the essential, the core, the mission, the heart, the why of being church. It's about understanding the difference between the form of church and its essential function. Jesus accomplished a great deal of churching without most of the processes, buildings, committees, rituals that we have. While the work we have ahead of us is going to be hard, we blessedly have an excellent role model for this kind of reform in Jesus, who did not think of himself as one creating a new thing out of nothing. He thought of himself as reshaping the institution that had lost its essential connection to the life-giving, grace-granting, human-loving nature of God's activity with the people Israel and those who cared to join in. So Jesus is a great role model for us to remember how hard this work ahead of us is, how hard it is to reform and return to the essential. It's dangerous. It makes people mad. It threatens those who most like and are empowered by church as it is. And I might even go so far as to suggest that we good churchgoers and clergy may be more like modern Pharisees than modern disciples. If we truly are the body of Christ, then we too are called to this work of reformation, of repenting, of turning around, of making straight the path. We're called out of the temples and into the byways of a new way of being. In fact, I'd argue that most of us have adapted to all kinds of cultural change, technological change. Our lives are actually radically different than they were in the 1980s. But for some reason, with our churches uniquely, we disallow change. I want to say that again. For some reason, we've all adapted to tons of change in almost all aspects of our lives. But we hold our churches to a different standard of unchangingness. Our favorite TV guide and Blockbuster are long gone, but over the same 40 years, our churches are not significantly different. To be the church is truly to be the body of Christ, to act as Jesus would in the world at this time and place. So I want to turn this over to Charlie now to give us some clear guidance on the shift from maintenance to mission. So I'm going to take just a second to give him the control for the mouse. You should have it now.
It says I have control of Susie's screen. And nothing is happening. Oh.
There you go. You just got it.
All right. There's a delay. Friends, my comments are scripted, and I'm sure I'd be more entertaining if I did this extemporaneously, but it would take at least twice as long, and I might leave something important out. And I realized that by scripting this, I've achieved almost an academic level of wordiness and density. And so I apologize in advance for that. All churches need spiritual vitality and financial viability to prosper. A church with low spiritual vitality is little more than a social club and may struggle to maintain member commitment. A church with low financial viability may struggle to maintain facilities and staffing. Financial viability does not mean there are no financial constraints. I have never been to a vital church that did not have unfulfilled dreams. While both vitality and viability are important, Many churches develop cultures that focus more on one than the other. The cultures are deeply rooted in attitudes towards money, which are often unexamined or not examined through the lens of faith. So borrowing from Christian Smith and Michael Emerson, I'm going to call a culture based on financial viability, pay the bills, and a culture based on spiritual vitality, live the vision. In the pay the bills culture, the institutional focus is on maintaining a balanced budget. In contrast, the live the vision culture is focused on nurturing members' spiritual lives. If you want a quick litmus test to assess where your congregation is, how much of your governing council and committee time is spent on budgetary matters, and how much is spent on mission and outreach? In the pay the bills culture, the focus is on serving members because contented members will provide financial support to the church. In the live the vision culture, the focus is on serving the world. The goal is not to keep people content, but to inspire people to serve God. In the pay the bills culture, the scarcity of resources is a cloud over the life of the church. Conservation of resources is always a concern. In the live the vision culture, there is confidence that focusing on faithfulness will lead to abundance or at least sufficiency. In the pay the bills culture, the congregation is an end in itself, in a sense that there is a sense of obligation to preserve and protect the institution. In the live the vision culture, the congregation is a means to an end, the fulfillment of God's plan by providing a home base for Christian faithfulness and ministry. In the pay the bills culture, the role of the pastor is to serve members by being a full service provider of local spiritual goods and services. People are expected to pay for services rendered and their fair share of institutional costs. In the live the vision culture, the role of the pastor is to empower and equip people to serve God. People are inspired to give and to help serve God. In the pay the bills cultures, members are consumers of services and expect to get their felt needs met. Members are expected to be self-concerned and pragmatic. In the live the vision culture, disciples are on a path of transformation of themselves. Disciples are focused on others and on stretching and growing. In the pay the bills culture, the Sunday morning worship is the center of congregational life, and having a really big show done really well is considered crucial to attracting and serving members. In the live the vision culture, living out the beautiful way of Jesus all week is at the center of congregational life. Now, here are some key points. Focusing on financial viability can undermine spiritual vitality. Focusing on financial viability is a terrible fundraising strategy. And spiritually vital churches are almost always financially viable. Mark Tidsworth, an author and consultant, captured this in a blog post. Funny, the more congregations give in to their anxiety about budget and buildings and membership, the less vitalized and attractive they become. The more congregations are caught up in the beautiful way of Jesus, living into their identity, finding their groove, so to speak, the greater their participation with God in transforming their community toward the kingdom. And that attracts the spiritual longing in we humans like honey to the bee. It's when we forget ourselves and join God's world makeover that we come alive. Then our relationship with the right institutional concerns finds its rightful place. Robert Quinn is my favorite management theologian. In his books about change, he talks about choosing between the road to slow death and deep change. I see this as the gospel, death or resurrection. The pay the bills culture is the road to slow death. Some of our churches have been on this road for a very long time and are now close to death. It also very much reflects our culture of mass consumerism by making church membership a transaction between a provider of spiritual goods and a consumer. Churches reinforce this idea whenever they imagine that offering better programs will be the best way to improve financial viability. The pay the bills culture also reflects American culture by emphasizing individual and congregational autonomy. The failure of the pay the bills culture is that taken as a whole, it presents church participation as just another leisure time option for consumers to consider. It sets low expectations, and surprisingly, members often live down to these expectations. The pay the bills culture is ultimately theologically bankrupt. In contrast, the live the vision culture is not about slow death, it is about deep change in response to God's call. In the gospel, it is a call to metanoia, to repent. Living the vision requires congregations and growing disciples to challenge and change the culture we find ourselves in, not to build congregations that conform to the culture. This includes embracing interdependence as reality and naming and opposing myths of autonomy. Instead of members consuming spiritual goods and services, the model of cultivating faith and helping people on the path of discipleship. Instead of trying to attract people with programs, congregations seek to engage people in mission, and instead of focusing on consumption, we focus on building deep relationships. In the live the vision culture, faithful living is a life commitment that guides the use of our time, talent, and treasure. Live the vision cultures will invite commitment. Some people will joyfully share their time, talent, and treasure. Well, some people will, some won't. It's important to note that adopting a vision statement will not change the culture of the church. And you can't simply declare that the church is adopting a new culture. Changing the culture means changing long-held beliefs and changing well-entrenched behaviors. This is hard to do. But my observation, and by the testimony of many people, most CTUCC churches have a pay the bills culture. Some churches have elements of the live the vision culture. A lot of people I have spoken with are attracted to the live the vision culture, but many of these people also see cultural change as difficult or impossible. The truth is that if you get a critical mass of people in a congregation that want to change the culture, there will also be people that will leave the congregation rather than participate in the change. Conflict avoidance keeps most churches on the road to slow death. But change is possible, especially if we are intentional about embracing change. Susie's going to address that in the next section.
Okay. So thank you, Charlie. I want to talk a little bit about creating a guiding coalition, and that is to help us to understand how we're going to actually get to that difference between maintenance and mission, and that difference between going to church and being the church. So how are we going to get there? So I'd like to turn again to John Kotter, who I referred to a lot in the first webinar, for some clarity of process. Now, we talked a lot about his idea that you first need to start with creating a sense of urgency. Today, I want to focus on step number 2, which is forming a powerful coalition. And that coalition is going to provide the leadership for the work of change ahead. They're going to keep you, the leaders, company, envision and dream with you, and help you to create the willpower and the way power in your organization. Really help you to do some of the cultural change. Do note that there's some overlap in all these steps. It's not strictly linear, so you can do some coalition forming even while you're working on a sense of urgency. How do you go about forming this coalition? Well, you need to spend some time with people one-on-one. Conversations with them about what they think we should be doing as a church to follow Jesus in this time. Conversations about their sense of the church, its state, and the urgency to change. You may want to think about inviting people into conversation, people who have power. And power, by the way, here is not a negative word, although power can be abused. Power for good is a good thing. So you may want to think about personal power, interpersonal power, and organizational power. And your coalitions should consist in those who at least have personal power, but may also have some organizational or interpersonal power as well. As you think about your coalition, the work of Everett Rogers may be helpful too. He was a researcher who spent a lot of time thinking about how people respond to innovation and parsed it out this way. When innovation is called for, he finds only a very small 2.5% are innovators. Then there is a group that is happy to adapt to the change quite early. And then there's the early majority. And when you get those three groups together, you have about 50% of your average population. Then there's the late majority and the laggards. Here's another version of this with some goofy names attached: innovative leaders, opinion leaders, early majority, and so on. But each of these get their names. So we get resistant, Rob and Ruth there at the end. And you will find that you have definitely in your church heard from your late adapter, your last adopters. They tend to let you know they're not happy when change is happening. In my experience, churches know and give a lot of airtime to those who are on either sides of this curve. We know where they are, they speak out, they let their opinion be known. But that some 60 to 70% of our church in the middle tend to be kind of quiet, and we don't have a lot of ideas about where they really are passionate and what they're thinking. Yet in order to change, you need to get all of those first three groups and a little bit of the fourth group moving forward with you. That's how change happens. So back to this first slide. Troublingly, innovators do not, by and large, hang out in our mainline churches. This is troubling news for us. If they are there, they do not tend to be socially connected. That's what research tells us. They tend to be people who are very comfortable with their own thoughts and with trying new things. So you may have to look for them around the edges of the church. So perhaps they're not a church member, but a partner to one of your church members. Maybe they show up only occasionally to a special program, or they run some curious aspect of your church's life. Or it may be that they're related to some organization and invested in some parts of your congregation tangentially. It may be true that some of your innovators and early adopters have also adopted themselves right out of the church and into a yoga practice or a hiking group or an environmental advocacy group. These are people who really like to be in organizations that are mission and vision driven. So your first job is really researching, exploring, discovering, and as I said earlier, it's a lot of these one-on-one conversations. You want to talk to as many people as you can in and around your church to understand where their passions lie. And when you decide who to talk to, you want to think about your leaders of goodwill, people who are good stalwarts, people who are not too noisy, who you haven't really heard from, and also seek out those who are our leaders, our innovators, and our early adopters. Children of the church who are nearby might be helpful, or those who show up for occasional services. So try to favor that left side of the slide as you do this work. These are people who might greet challenge and change with a sense of optimism and hope. And what do you talk to them about? Well, ask a lot of questions about what energizes them. What about Jesus is worth following? Ask them to articulate their sense of the core mission, the why of the church, and the degree to which you are living out that mission right now. Ask them whether they have a sense of urgency. Ask them who else you should talk to, maybe a friend, a neighbor, or a spouse. And by doing this, you'll discover some people who have some clarity about the mission and have some passion clarity and optimism about change. And when you know who these people are, then you might want to pull them together and create an initial gathering. And once again, when you have that gathering, you're still primarily asking some questions. You're asking for clarity. You're asking these people to kind of discover where your mission will come from. So the job is really to ask some great questions. So after you've done that, you may want to form a formal team to work on clarifying the why and envisioning a change to move to a more missional church approach, that vision part of the work. Now, don't make that typical church mistake and think that the only those who are on this formal team are the important leaders of your change. Your coalition is both a formal team and some of these people who may not join a formal team, but you've identified, who are people you want to keep in mind in prayer and in communication. They may be as important as your formal team in making your church's mission and your church's change a reality. In short, you want to know who has the heart of an innovator, an early adopter, an opinion leader, and how you're going to get past that middle of this curve, this bell curve, and get into that area, that sweet spot where change can actually happen. In summary, what I'm talking about is knowing your church, the official members and those who are part of its ministry catchment, if you will, where they are in regard to the capacity for change, where they are in terms of understanding the urgency. Do they have a sense of the mission and the why? Think of leadership holistically and organically, not just formally, and empower the majorities over the loud voices at the end. So that's the work of creating your coalition. And along with Charlie's wisdom about focusing on mission, we hope that this resource will help you in your thinking and doing to increase the vitality, creativity, and impact of your ministry. So I'm going to turn this back to Charlie, who has some summary comments.
Thank you, Susie. I'd like to make 2 points. If your church is on the road to slow death, there is no risk-free option. Staying on the road to slow death leads to death. Attempting to change and failing at that might also lead to death, maybe even a quicker death, but only change can lead to vitality. And the second thing I want to say is change is not something you have to grudgingly accept as the price of survival. Change is the opportunity to embrace new life, in the opportunity to serve God with gladness. And we need to enter into these processes with that gladness of heart and hoping for a better future because we know that the opportunity is out there.
Thanks, Charlie. And I'll just add to that I think a lot of times churches do get nervous about change and think about who you might lose because you're doing something that's going to make someone unhappy. But we need to remember that if we don't change, we are also quietly losing members who simply become dissatisfied with the church that doesn't have enough heart for the ministry and mission of Christ. So no matter what you do, you're going to be losing some members. So you might as well go ahead and embrace change with a sense of optimism and a sense of purpose and hope and following Jesus. So we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. If you have a question, feel free to go ahead and type it into the chat. And I just will say that this is being recorded. It's also being recorded on Facebook Live. So I hear that you should actually be able to see it there pretty quickly. And I will be sending out a link to the recording a set of the slides and also a few other for further reading kind of resources sometime in the next day or two. Any other questions? Can a consultant be helpful in this process? Yes, I think consultants can be helpful in this process, and the degree to which you have the leadership to really push what consultant will work on with you forward is the degree to which a consulting process will be really effective in your church. And there are some really interesting consultants out there and different approaches. So yes, a consultant can be helpful. Any other questions? I wanted to mention that we are working on starting to design the next webinar and would welcome any comments that you have about what you'd like us to include in that next webinar, which we're envisioning is the final one of this series. However, if you have so many ideas that we need to do yet more, we can. And I also want to say that we're still kind of working out some of the kinks of the technology, so give us a little bit of grace around that. I got another question, which is, can you give us some additional examples of spiritual practices that are on the uptick? That's a great question, Jack, and I want to say that that's part of what we're doing at the General Association event, which if you haven't registered for, the registration closes tonight at midnight. So you can get to that on our website. People from howwegather.org will be talking about some ways that people are gathering in the millennials are gathering, and younger coalitions groups are gathering that are addressing the needs, the spiritual needs of different generations. So that might be a really helpful event for you to go to. I hear a lot about authentic community and engaged service as spiritual practices that are very attractive. And I also hear that there is a renewal of interest in reimagined and refreshed traditional liturgical practices. So those are three that I might name. What is the role of pastoral leaders in leading change? Pastoral leaders are essential in leading change, and they're essential in creating a coalition that helps that change to happen as well. The vision casting part of leadership is something that some leaders have an innate sense for, and others look to create the coalition, have the coalition create that vision together. Both are valid ways of creating vision. Honestly, the next step, which is really important, is getting planful about how you're going to turn vision into reality. How do you get strategic? How do you design and target your resources so they're going towards the strategy of enacting your vision?
I'd like to add, you may feel as a pastor that you weren't trained to lead change, depending on when and where you went to seminary. And you don't have to be a process expert to be a leader. And one of the most important things a pastor can do is to inspire hope within the congregation and guide people towards greater faithfulness and hope in the future. And I hope that all clergy were trained to do that as ministers of the gospel. Another important role of the pastoral leader is to identify the key people in the congregation and cultivate relationships with them and bring them into the circle of participation. And never underestimate the power of a personal invitation to engage people. Announcements don't work, letters don't work, broadcasting doesn't work. Sitting down with somebody and talking about your view for the future and asking them to join you, that has power and that can help you build a coalition.
We have another question, which is, what are some resources church leaders can use to increase spiritual vitality? Charlie, you want to start that one?
Gosh, there are a number of newsletters and websites that you can go to that will provide you with a stream of ideas. I happen to like the Lewis Center for Church Leadership and their weekly newsletter and blog posts. I think on our resource list, we have links to some other sites. There is a lot of helpful information out there, and it's worth spending a little time looking for it. And I think much of it can help guide and inspire you.
I might add to that if you take the approach that spiritual vitality is going to be increased by adding programs to your church, that's not so helpful. I think spiritual vitality is really connected to having a very clear sense of your mission, your why, what is at the core of your church's life. That sort of clarity, and then getting strategic about how you're going to become that vision or become that why, become that purposeful organization. That's how vitality can become increased. I just had this conversation today with someone who had been listening to the elders in their church and came away from that reflecting that she thinks the elders are asking the church to become the beloved community. And I think becoming the beloved community is a fabulous vision. So how do you go about doing it? How do you get really strategic? What does it mean to be the beloved community? And it's parsing that out and then figuring out how to deliver on it. Any other questions? Well, we want to thank you so much for signing in tonight. We hope that this has been helpful. We really would treasure any feedback you have, so feel free to send us an email. I will likely be sending a very quick Survey Monkey out along with the resources in the next couple of days. And again, if there's particular things you would like us to take on in the next webinar a little bit more, we'd be delighted to do that. Thank you all. We hope you have a terrific evening, and God bless you.
Thank you.